Is up, everybody? I'm Steve Espew, and welcome back to Draft for Dummies, by Dummies, for Dummies. This week we're going to be going over weather. What are the pros and cons of weather in draft? This topic was requested by Hong Kong Goose 776. I greatly appreciate you. If any of you guys have any other suggestions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I'll be sure to cover them eventually. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you don't want to miss any more of my draft content, and let's get right into it. So, why are the main reasons why people like to draft weather? Mainly because it's fairly easy to learn. If you're a newcomer to draft, usually drafting weather as your first or second team is not a bad idea. It lets you be able to get really into it, and it has very obvious synergies, and it's a very straightforward game plan. But not only this, but it's generally a strong playstyle, depending on the weather that you have and the team that you end up drafting. Generally speaking, weather is very strong. And of course, it's a very simple plan. You set up weather, and eventually you hope to be able to set up and sweep with your sun, rain, sand, or snow sweepers. And while the game plan may be simple, it can have a wide variety depending on the team that you are building. So first off, we're going to be starting off with sun, which is very widely claimed to be one of the best weathers in modern generations. And that's mainly because of the paradox Pokemon that were added in Gen 9. They have a huge amount of type diversity, as well as just being very strong, high base stat total Pokemon. If you can get about 3 Paradox Pokemon, as well as your Sunsetter and your Chlorophyll Sweeper, generally speaking, you are doing very well as a Sun team. Basically what Sun does, it boosts the damage of fire type moves and it decreases the damage of water type moves. And that is really nice because if you end up stacking a good amount of fire types on your Sun team, it'll both make them better offensively as well as defensively, because water types are one of the biggest threats to fire types, and being able to weaken that oncoming damage onto them is very helpful. And like I mentioned, Chlorophyll Sweepers, basically it means that your speed stat gets doubled in Sun, and there are many grass types that work very well in Sun. Defensively, it does not match up very well because they're already weak to fire, so making them even more weak to fire isn't ideal. However, there are some where that doesn't exactly matter. Venusaur is, regardless, one of the best chlorophyll sweepers out there, and it is, at the end of the day, weak to fire. Generally speaking, you get more benefit than risk from that. And essentially what your game plan is, you draft Ninetales or Torkoal. Usually Torkoal is the better one, however it is often more expensive than Ninetales, so if you want something a bit faster, maybe a bit more frail, and you want to save on some points, Ninetales is your go-to. But typically, Torkoal is very nice because it adds rapid spin support, as well as being able to set up rocks. And generally speaking, having a more defensive setter is usually on the better side. There are some instances where this isn't always the case, but generally speaking, a defensive setter is always nice. And then of course, you want to stack as many Photosynthesis Mons as possible. Usually Gouging Fire, Walking Wake, and Great Tusk are your main ones, though you do have Pokemon like Raging Bolt that are also very good in this instance as well. Same thing as Screamtail. Screamtail is also very good. And then you also want 1 or 2 Chlorophyll Sweepers. Like I mentioned, if you can get Venusaur, that would be really good. Otherwise, Vileplume is also still fairly good. Typically speaking, Victory Bell isn't always the best. Also, another very underrated Sun Sweeper would be Scovillain, and that is because you're a grass type that's both not weak to fire, as well as you get Fire Stab as well. So having Chlorophyll as well as Fire Stab and a turn 1 Solar Beam as well as Growth, generally speaking, Scovillain is not a bad idea either, and you do save a lot of points on it. It's not amazing, but it is still fairly decent. And then next up we have rain, which for the longest time has been considered to be the best weather, just for sheer dominance and strength. I would argue that sun is better in modern generations, though rain is still very strong. With rain, it boosts the power of water damage and weakens the power of fire damage. It's pretty much the opposite of sun. The main thing you want with rain is that it boosts your water damage. Weakening fire damage isn't the best thing in the world because you're already resisting fire on a lot of your rain sweepers because you're already a water type, though in some instances this isn't always true, but generally speaking it's not the main thing you're looking for. Usually you want very strong water offense. Swift Swim is the chlorophyll of rain where it doubles your speed in rain, and there are so many really good Swift Swimmers out there. Tentacruel is really good, Ludicolo is crazy, and your main two that you really like to look out for are Kingdra and Mega Swampert. Another really good one is Barraskewda. The main thing that you would always be seeing with this is they're all water types. So you do have a lot of water type Pokemon on Rain, even more than you would have fire types on Sun, and that is because you don't have the Paradox Pokemon for any Rain that you would be able to get that coverage for type-wise. There are some Pokemon out there that do very good in Rain and that are not water types. One example of this would be Archaludon because of its Electroshock move, as well as Pokemon like Zapdos being able to hit 100% accurate Hurricanes, Toxicroak getting dry skin healing from being in the rain. There are some really good Pokemon that benefit a lot from rain. Steel types generally do fairly well in rain and they're already a really good type, but generally speaking, with rain, you just want to stack a shit ton of really strong water types to be able to sweep teams. You don't exactly want a bunch of defense, and typically you want Pelipper or Politoed as your rain setter. Pelipper is usually the better one, like I mentioned. It's a lot more defensive than Politoed would be, though if you want to save a few points and maybe have a little bit more utility with like Encore, maybe Perish Song, Politoed is not a bad option either. And then typically you would want even more than 2 Swift Swimmers, potentially even with something like a Quillfish is not bad either. An Overquill is really good because it's one of the few Pokemon out there that get Swift Swim and is not a water type, and it's a Poison and Dark type, which is already a really good typing. You always want Archaludon on your Rain team. Archaludon is one of the most busted rain sweepers out there. And then, like I mentioned before, you want some non-water types that benefit from the rain while not being water types, like I mentioned before. Toxicroak, Heliolisk, Zapdos. These are all Pokemon that benefit from the rain while not being water types, and they help diversify your coverage. And then next up, we got Sand. Typically, I would consider Sand to be the least powerful of the 4 in modern generations, and that is mainly because T-Tar has fallen off quite significantly, but I would still say it is still good, but having a 4 times weakness to fighting isn't great. Rock is just generally a bad typing. Getting Stab Knockoff now is really great, but having only really 2 good Sand Sweepers in Dracovish and Excadrill kinda is unfortunate, especially considering everything else on your team that's not a rock, steel, or ground type is taking chip damage every turn. It's really not ideal for the rest of your team, and you really don't want to be stacking a bunch of rock types specifically on your team. Ground and steel, it's not the worst thing to have multiples of, but when you start stacking a bunch of those same weaknesses, it becomes really unideal. With Sand, you see a Spadef boost to all rock types, as well as deal damage over time to every non-steel, rock, or ground types. Again, this is really not the worst thing in the world, though typically with Sand you don't want to plan your entire strategy around Sand. Usually it's just a supplement to the rest of your team. You don't want to build a full Sand team, really, because a lot of the times it will leave you lacking, I feel like. Generally, your plan is you're going to draft T-Tar or Hippowdon as your Sand setter. Usually, T-Tar is your better option, mainly because it doesn't overlap in typing with your main sweeper in Excadrill, unlike Hippowdon. T-Tar can be both offensive and defensive, whereas Hippowdon is kind of exclusively defensive. It still has its niche, of course, but at the same time, it is not as oppressive as T-Tar, though you do save some points on it, so it really just depends where you're spending the rest of your points. And then, like I mentioned, getting Excadrill and or Dracovish as a sweeper is very nice, and then just trying to fill in roles where Sand doesn't exactly hinder you, while also being able to diversify your typings is very important with Sand still. Regardless of whether or not they're going to be taking that chip damage or not, that's just something that you're going to have to play around a lot. Maybe getting some Magic Guard Pokemon, that would be really nice. That sort of thing is pretty good with Sand. And then for our final weather, we have the biggest glow up in Gen 9, Snow, or in earlier generations, Hail. It used to be the worst weather. Pretty much you got none of the benefits that Sand did with the boosting of one of your defenses, and you would just do damage all over time to every non-ice type. Generally speaking, that is a terrible weather. You also do get 100% accurate blizzards, but that's not really worth the downsides. But in Gen 9, when Snow was introduced and replaced Hail, now it no longer does damage over time and all steel types get a defense boost. Add this on top of Aurora Veil coming in Gen 7, And this is a massive boost to the snow weather as a whole, because now you have Pokemon like Abomasnow and your Alola Ninetales to be able to set up Aurora Veil and not only get more defense on their end from the snow boost, but also support the rest of their team with the Aurora Veil defense and special defense boosts. And now, because it no longer does damage over time, now it can work as a supplement to all teams. So pretty much you don't have to run a full snow team to be able to be viable. You can essentially run your 1, maybe 2 ice type Pokemon, set up Aurora Veil, and then just have a bunch of setup sweepers as well as maybe some hazards, and that's your team. It's not exactly something you want to build your entire team style around, but it is definitely something good to be able to supplement the rest of your team. Unlike Sand, where you only want it to supplement because it's not very good, with Snow now, you want to supplement it because it is really, really good. And your main draft plan, of course, is you want to draft whatever team style you really want. I would recommend more of a hyper offense or a more offensive leaning balance type team, because when you're setting up Aurora Veil, it is incredibly valuable to be able to get in your setup sweepers under that Aurora Veil, because it really facilitates them getting those boosts off to be able to potentially get a sweep off. Maybe you would have one snow sweeper, something like maybe a well-placed Beartic, maybe an Alola Sandslash if it's in a Terra metagame. Baxcalibur is probably one of the biggest offenders of being a snow sweeper that can be insanely threatening. Generally speaking, Snow, Hail, I would probably put it at number 3 in recent generation. But before Gen 9, Hail was a terrible weather. I would almost never recommend drafting it. Maybe Gen 8 and Gen 7 wasn't the worst thing in the world because you still had Aurora Veil, but that damage over time is still very unideal. So, overall, what are the downsides to drafting weather? Because I have been very positive on weather overall, maybe some are better than others, but generally speaking, what are the downsides? The biggest downside I would probably say, it is very predictable. Usually when an opponent is looking at your team, they know exactly what you're going to do if you have a very weather-centric team. If they see you with a Barraskewda and Pelipper and Archaludon, they're going to be like, okay, he's going to try to set up rain, maybe a few hazards on me, and try to get an Archaludon or Barraskewda sweep. Pretty understandable on their end, and of course you don't always have to do that, of course, but generally speaking it is your best option to be able to threaten your opponent, so why wouldn't you? But because it's so predictable, oftentimes it can have very obvious counterplay options. Throwing on a single Pokemon, maybe 2, a Sunny Day to be able to get rid of your Rain, or Rain Dance to get rid of your Sun, etc. Or even just combating with your own weather setter if your opponent is drafting Sun and you are drafting Rain. Maybe that is a very good counterplay option for you. And also it's very matchup reliant. Sometimes your opponent is just naturally better into the type that you mainly specialize in. That's probably why I would say Sun is the best weather in Gen 9, because it has so much variety when in terms of typings, so you aren't getting those very matchup reliant weeks every single time. Though there are some times with Rain, or heck, even Sun still, there are some times where your team is just not going to be as good. And of course that is with every single team, but I feel like with weather it can be a lot more obvious to see. And of course, finally, it's generally a very low ceiling gameplay. There are some drafters out there who are incredibly creative with how they utilize weather, being able to use very underrated sweepers to be able to facilitate sweeps in the late game. But generally speaking, there's a very low skill ceiling to weather. There's only so good that you're going to get from it, and you're not really going to get much higher than that. Of course, it all depends on how you play. But at the end of the day, for the casual draft league player, usually weather is just something that you get into, you do well with, but you're not going to reach a higher level skill from only doing weather. But anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Don't forget to like, comment, and sub to not miss any more of my draft league content. I greatly appreciate it. Don't you guys worry, the hyper offense video will be coming this upcoming week. I think it's going to be incredibly cool. There's going to be some really interesting things that are going to be going on. All good things come with time. And anyways guys, I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.